This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I don't engage in politics on this podcast, but when it comes to this year's presidential election, I can't think of a more appropriate composition than the late Frederic Rzewski's 36 variations on the Sergio Ortega Chilean resistance anthem El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido. The people united will never be defeated. This set of variations is an eclectic virtuoso tour de force that takes both pianist and listener on a journey through what amounts to being a history of the piano, from romantic etude-like variations to thorny dissonance and haunting minimalism, from blues and folk songs to grim marches. The 36 variations fall into groups of 6 and are actually rather rigorously constructed. Back in 2015, I presented an episode of my weekly radio show Between the Keys that I devoted to The People United to mark this work's 40th anniversary of its composition. It was written in 1975, and my guest on the program was pianist Ursula Opin, for whom Frederic Rzewski composed The People United, and she also was the pianist who gave this work its world premiere in Washington, D.C. in 1976. I have posted a link to that episode in my podcast description so that you can hear extended excerpts from the work, along with an interview that I did with Ursula Opin. And also on this program, I give a spoken overview about the work. I've also posted a link to the booklet notes that I wrote about The People United for the recording made by Marc-Andre Hamelin for the Hyperion label. So, with all of these links handy, I'm not going to talk about this composition in detail, but since The People United has been recorded numerous times, and because I'm writing a comprehensive guide to The People United on disc for International Piano magazine, I thought I would talk about just a few recorded versions that might help you get started to appreciate this work. And also, the versions I'm going to be talking about have gained some semblance of critical consensus over the years. However, my article is going to cover each and every People United recording in detail, so watch out for that. And I promise that I'm not going to be talking about each and every recording on this episode. If I did, we'd wind up with a 2-hour podcast, and I don't think you want that. So I'm just going to talk about a few recordings, and thank you for understanding. Now, just as a little aside, when I first proposed writing a discographical overview of The People United many years ago for Gramophone magazine, Frederic Rzewski was still around, and because Frederic and I were great friends and that he was my frequent house guest, we would always have long conversations, and, we played some concerts together on 2 pianos, and when he visited and stayed at my apartment, we often would show each other our compositions in progress, and we sometimes would play forehands. We'd read through orchestra works and forehand arrangements, and Frederic was just the most incredible sight reader, by the way. Anyway, I was thinking about doing this overview about People United recordings, and I actually proposed to Frederic that we could collaborate on a written overview that I was going to do for Gramophone about all of the People United recordings, or maybe at least he could offer his comments on certain recordings, because we often did have conversations about these recordings, and he did talk about which ones he liked and which ones he liked less. So I had the idea to do something along the lines of, when Igor Stravinsky reviewed 3 different recordings of The Rite of Spring, And that's a very famous and interesting article. It's famous for Stravinsky's concluding line, which was something to the effect of, "None of these three recordings are worthy of preservation." Unfortunately, Frederic died before he and I could finally get together on our Rzewski Review Rzewski project. But over the years, I did take note of what he liked and what he didn't like. Not that I always agreed with him on these points, I should add. So let's go to the recordings, and to quote the opening line of Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, "To begin at the beginning." Frederic made the very first recording of The People United. It was released in 1977 on the small Italian label Edizioni Cultura Popolare. I've never heard this recording, and only recently I noticed that it had been uploaded to a blog sometime around 2014, but the recording was deleted from this blog long before I could download it. So if there are any Piano Maven listeners who have access to this recording, I would be very curious and grateful to at least hear it. Eventually, Rzewski did re-record The People United, and I'm going to get to his re-recordings in a little bit. But I will mention Ursula Opin's 1979 recording for Vanguard. It remains a really excellent version, absolutely solid from top to bottom. The pianism is as secure and as masterful as you would expect from this fantastic artist. It does not have an improvised cadenza, mainly because, as Ursula told me, there simply was not room for one given the limitations of the LP. But this was the recording that most people imprinted on in the early 1980s, and it was available for a while on LP, and it's had some CD incarnations. Marc-Andre Hamelin recorded The People United for Altaris in the late 1980s. This recording was never released, by the way. However, Mark's 1997 Hyperion recording raised the bar in many respects for sheer pianistic proficiency. Now, Frederic told me that he thought that Mark underplayed the march rhythms, but I don't agree with that. I think Mark's marching is perfectly fine. Maybe at times the phrasing can be rounded off to a fault, particularly in variations that resemble folk songs, where personally I play these themes in a more plain-spoken, less inflected way. Mark kind of prettifies them a little bit, but I have to tell you that this is an aesthetic choice, and it is not a fault by any means. And his command and his authority and his extraordinary virtuosity really speak for themselves. And he also has the benefit of great engineering. And I wrote the booklet notes, I should tell you. I did tell you that before. Oh, I do have to tell you that Mark also plays a wonderful and really creative cadenza before the theme comes back at the end. Igor Levit got lots of attention a few years back when he released a triple album on Sony Classical that consisted of 3 big variation sets: the Bach-Goldberg variations, the Beethoven-Diabelli variations, and Rzewski's People United. I like Igor Levit's People United a lot. The really difficult variations pose absolutely no problems for Igor Levit's fingers, and he also understands that the march rhythms and variations, like number 26 and similar places, benefit from a steady and resolute gait. And I've heard some pianists accelerate these for effect, and that's just plain wrong. And also, Igor Levit plays a brilliant cadenza. I don't know if he wrote it out or he improvised it, but it's really terrific. If I had to make one quibble, and this is really a half quibble or a 1/3 quibble, sometimes I want to hear more textural differentiation in thicker contrapuntal passages, such as in variation number 8. And in this variation, I think Ursula Opin's and Rzewski himself clarify the counterpoint to more effective degree. And sometimes Igor Levit tapers the theme when it comes back at different places. If it was by Grieg or Chopin, I mean, you don't need hairpins. I would just play the theme plain. And you know, I've heard quite a few performances of People United by young pianists who automatically apply generic expressive devices throughout. And, you know, it's kind of like a one-size-fits-all kind of rubato. And, you know, just don't get me started on that. But Igor Levit is absolutely world-class in People United. However, there is one recent recording that in many respects is very unidiomatic, but I found it really riveting. Although most of the recordings we have of People United differ in detail from Rzewski's own performance, they all seem to use Rzewski's self-interpretation as a frame of reference or at least a jumping-off point. However, the recording by Vadim Kenko for Harmonium Mundi entirely goes its own way in terms of tempo, phrasing, accent, and dynamics. And it's essentially a pianistically oriented conception that draws attention to itself for sheer virtuosity and prowess and coloristic potential. One very telling example of this is the really soft suppleness of Kolidenko's staccato articulation in the virtuosic fourth section of variations. There's also a wide degree of tempo fluctuation and fanciful pedaling, as if Ignaz Friedman had pushed Rzewski off of the piano bench. The introspective variation 27, I think Kolidenko plays way the hell too fast. But then again, the last 6 variations, which can often seem forced and tacked on, have a kind of uncommon urgency and an intense sense of build that leads into this really awesome improvised cadenza. I have a feeling that Rzewski would have really liked this recording because once when I asked Frederic, do you ever get sick and tired of so many people playing and recording the People United, especially when you have so much other piano music out there that doesn't get equal attention? He said to me that he only wanted to hear a young pianist play People United if they brought something new and original to the interpretation. And certainly Vadim Kolidenko's People United doesn't sound anything like the other versions in the catalog, so I have to give him propers for that. However, you cannot discuss the People United without looking in on Rzewski's own 1986 recording that appeared on the Hat Art label. He personally complained about this recording when I asked him about it because I think he had issues with the sound quality. I don't know. I think it sounds perfectly fine. I mean, the microphone placement is a little close, but I think that only helps to underline the forthrightness and the strong rhythmic impact of Rzewski's playing. Also, he voices chords in a way where the harmonies really sing out, and, of course, his own fantastic improvising in the cadenza. His recording of People United from the late 1990s that was released on Nonsuch is not as strong technically from a pianistic standpoint, and the energy seems to flag toward the end. But Frederic told me that this was a one-take performance. He just played the piece straight through, and that you're supposed to feel exhausted by the end. I mean, you can't deny the authenticity that having the composer at the piano. But I think his 1986 Hat Art recording preserves Frederic's interpretation in his best pianistic estate. And there are many live performances of Frederic playing The People United that are floating around the internet. And there's also a video that was officially released that's basically a straight-through warts and all performance. But I'm saving the best for last, perhaps, when I talk about Ursula Opin and her 2014 remake of The People United that came out on the Chicago CD label. I prefer this to her 1979 recording. First of all, the sound is better, and her dynamic range opens up so much more. I think she's a lot more daring, and she reveals more of Frederic's voice leading from variation to variation. You really get a sense of where the counterpoint is moving. And she makes a big difference between variation 15's folk-like simplicity and variation 16's elaboration. And the jagged variation 19 that usually gets banged out and hits you over the head becomes something more playful and acerbic in Ursula Opin's hands. Also, her improvised cadenza is lovely. It's more lyrical and contained than the wilder, more show-offy specimens in the catalog. And I think it's entirely appropriate because her cadenza really helps to set up the theme's reinstatement at the very end. So which of these versions of The People United to have, if you're going to have more than one or only one? I would definitely try to hear them all. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast, there are quite a few worthy contenders that I did not discuss, but I will be covering them in my International Piano article about every recording ever made of The People United. For those who really care about this work, I would definitely recommend trying to find Rzewski's own 1986 Hat Art recording. I don't know if it's easily available in physical format, so you're probably going to have to hunt around for it. But overall, the pianistic mastery and the musical authenticity and the mix of intuition and insight that informs Ursula Opin's 2014 recording for CD, I think ultimately adds up to a first choice. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode. Take care.